Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Preston Auditorium for our last event of the day. We saved the best for last today, and we're now going to begin with the Law, Justice, and Development Week 2018 keynote session featuring our distinguished speakers, including Mr. Volker Turk, who's the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at UNHCR, Dr. Helen Durham, Director of International Law Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, Sandy Okoro, Senior Vice President and World Bank Group General Counsel, and World Bank Senior Director for Fragility, Conflict, and Violence, Mr. Frank Bousquet. In a conversation titled Bridging the Humanitarian Development Divide, Different Approaches to Similar Programs. This will be moderated by World Bank Group Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Relations, Sheila Redzepi. Please note that this session is broadcast live on the World Bank Live channel. As you will hear from each guest, please use your phones and mobile devices to directly interact with our guest speakers on social media using the hashtag LJDWeek2018. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ms. Sandy Okoro to our stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you've had a really enjoyable day so far and that you are enthused and ready for this keynote session. I also hope that you've all downloaded the app. You are on Twitter, you're talking, you're exchanging ideas, you've seen Facebook Live. I hope all the social media is going on, and I have had lots of interaction myself, so it's hashtag LJDWeek 2018. This session is a very important discussion, and I'd like to thank our excellent panelists who you just heard would be joining us today. They have a very, very busy schedule, so we're very lucky indeed to have them with us. Last year has been a year of many, many celebrations. We celebrated 70 years of our successful relationship with the United Nations. We also celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we here at the spring meetings had an event with the then UN Human Rights Commissioner, Prince Zaid Al Hussein, to celebrate the anniversary of that declaration. But while celebrating old relationships, we formally reconnected with many other partners. We worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross over the course of the last 2 years to respond to the immediate needs of persons affected by drought. Working closely on the ground showed us how closely interlinked our work truly is. It showed us that the needs of people in conflict-affected areas would be better addressed if we shared our expertise. Therefore, earlier this year, we formally established a strategic partnership to work towards these goals. Helen and Frank are here to speak about the ways in which we can do this, and you'll hear from them in a moment. Reflecting our increased engagement in helping developing countries affected by the sudden influx of refugees, we partnered with UNHCR to deliver better financing solutions. We realised we could deliver better when our actions complemented each other. This drove us to establish a data centre to better inform the solutions we develop. And in doing so, we worked as partners towards the new Global Compact on Refugees. Volker and Frank are here to speak more about these partnerships. Over the course of the next 30 minutes, and it will be a lightning 30 minutes, you will hear Helen, Volker and Frank, in that order, discuss their work in the area of trying to bridge the humanitarian development divide. We will then all come up on stage and sit down, and then the rest of the session will be moderated by Sheila Redzepi, my friend, and our Vice President for ECR, who has generously agreed to give up her time and join us here today, and realises that lawyers can be fun too. Right, Sheila? I hope you'll be able to see the progress we have made since we embarked on the work on this concept in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit. I hope you will be able to appreciate as much as we have the different approaches needed to tackle the complex development problems we face. I hope you will be able to take back some lessons from our conversation. I absolutely hope you'll be able to help us take ideas forward. Remember what I said this morning, ideas are bulletproof. But more than anything, I hope you will enjoy the session as much as we have enjoyed putting it together. Thank you. And now I turn to Helen, our first speaker, to come up on stage. Helen.
Thank you very much, Sandy, and I'm very honoured to be here today. Well, since the dawn of time, humanity's inhumanity to humanity has been a constant. And whilst we look through history books and we see armed conflict, battles, turbulence over land, power, territory, ideology, and resources, if you look really carefully in any history book or any religion, you also see limitations during times of armed conflict. So the area of law that I work in, that the International Committee of the Red Cross works in, that we're a guardianship of, is called International Humanitarian Law, often known as IHL or the Law of War. And what I plan to do today, in a few minutes, is give you a little bit of the background and the history of IHL, a little bit about what we do and what it is, and also look at the future of how we need to make sure more intelligently and more rigorously we interface IHL and the work done during times of armed conflict with development needs. But to start with the history, what is interesting is the International Committee of the Red Cross was created by a banker. So in fact, I felt very comfortable being here today. Back in the 1850s, a Swiss banker, very serious gentleman there, Henry Dunant, required a signature from Napoleon III for a business transaction, something that us business lawyers or you business lawyers will understand well. But of course in those days there was not email, so he had to travel onto the battlefield in a place called Solferino in Italy to get this signature. Now he was shocked and horrified at the suffering he saw on the battlefield, and he came up with this idea of multilateral treaties to limit suffering during times of armed conflict. And thus the idea of the International Committee of the Red Cross was born through a book that he wrote, and thus the first treaty in 1864, which basically limited suffering by requiring that those who were supporting the medical mission, so the medical people on the battlefield, could be protected, and protected by a Red Cross, which was an inverse of the Swiss flag, standing for neutrality. After that came the today 191 Red Cross and Red Crescent societies that are in each of your countries, doing very good work, often in peacetime. But the ICRC was granted a specific legal mandate, a particular legal personality, to undertake certain activities during times of armed conflict. We visit people detained, we provide assistance, and we have guardianship of the laws of war, found in the 4 Geneva Conventions and their 2 additional protocols. Now, the thing about the laws of war is it's almost a counterintuitive area of international law. It asks for humanity, a piece of humanity, during the times of conflict. So the most difficult times human can experience, the laws of war require minimum humanity. That if you're wounded on the battlefield or shipwrecked at sea, you should be given protection and medical treatment. That civilians, under the principle of distinction, should not be attacked. Military attacks should only focus on military objectives. And that detainees, those who are out of the battlefield, need to be treated with minimum humanity. But there's over 448 articles in the book that I brought up, I like to carry it around, of the Geneva Conventions. But at the end of the day, this complex normative legal regime boils down to a very simple proposition, that what unites us as people, as individuals, as humans is deeper and more profound than what divides us. But saying that, the laws of war is a very tough and pragmatic regime. It's lex specialis. It allows, if I may say it bluntly, killing, certain degree of killing with impunity. It allows combatants to attack combatants. It allows people to be detained for an indefinite amount of time, prisoners of war or civilian internees, who have not committed a crime, but to be detained during times of armed conflict. So its application must be very carefully thought through. But during times of armed conflict, and my own experience as a delegate in the field, it saves lives. So that's the start of the ICRC through the prism of a banker. I think most of those gentlemen were all bankers in Switzerland. So I think they had a good understanding about restraint and limitation. So for 150 years, the ICRC has been, as I mentioned before, guardians of this area of law called international humanitarian law. And what we do is have an obligation upon us, granted to us by states through our international legal personality, to disseminate or educate all parties in a conflict to IHL, to the limitations. And that is both the military, but also non-state armed groups. And I think what is very important for us as lawyers and others interested in humanitarian issues and development is to not put all non-state armed groups in the same category. We recently did a very large study, 3 years, where we identified centralised non-state armed groups, those we can engage with a central command, decentralised non-state armed groups, where it's quite difficult to find the entry point, and community-embedded groups. So I think it's very important that we have, if we really want to move forward, have a sophisticated understanding of those that we're engaged who often, what we call, destroy development holds. Now, it's pretty obvious to say, but armed conflict exacerbates pre-existing inequalities that you find in society. So armed conflict often not only makes the whole of a state or an area fragile, it digs in deep where the communities have previously not been able to give equality. And if IHL or the laws of war are complied with, if there is an understanding of the principle of distinction, and so in targeting decisions, hospitals, water sanitation environments, places of worship, cultural property, essential infrastructure. There's a particular article in the additional protocols of the IHL regime that requires the preservation of essential infrastructure that civilians need to survive. And I think when we have the discussion, we'll be able to interface on that issue, but there is something very important about that. So we do training not only with non-state armed groups, but also with military, and last year some of my colleagues engaged in training over 20,000 military officers who then do their own training. But one of the things I wanted to quickly finish up on was the interface between the need for ICRC to go to places that other people don't go and to ensure that essential infrastructure like water is protected. To ensure that we are able to come to terms with different types of warring parties, with different narratives and different myths, and find ways to engage in ensuring that they understand that even wars have limits. And I wanted to finish on this. It's a short story of something that came out recently from our research. And it's how to engage with non-state armed groups to make sure that they don't pull down those development holds. It's a group in South Sudan, you may have heard of the White Army, that our delegates in the field were really finding were creating a lot of problems, a lot of death, a lot of destruction. And we're having difficulty in discussing the normative framework. As you can imagine, with a group like this, you don't hold up the lovely Geneva Conventions. I've been told in many places, thank you, Dr. Hallen, that's really nice, but when we think of the Geneva, we think of chocolate and cuckoo clocks. We don't necessarily think of a normative legal regime. They don't put it that way, but I know what they're saying. So in this instance, we found that the group of these cattle herders, that during the day were cattle herders and at night were warriors, loved wrestling. And when we noticed them wrestling, we were able to discuss with them. So when you wrestle, can you go and wrestle that little old lady under the tree? No, of course not. They laughed at us. Can you wrestle this small child that's sitting over there? Don't be stupid. The way wrestling is, you have to wrestle a worthy opponent. And through that, we were able to start discussing with them the laws of war. I think it's really critical, really exciting, really challenging that the ICRC has going forward a stronger relationship with the World Bank. The sort of work we do, the requirements that we put on all those engaged in conflict, can actually make a difference to society in a way that is more than just saving lives. It's about ensuring that the essential infrastructure that we then all need to go forward through the development paradigm survives what is the most horrific times humans can experience, which is armed conflict. So thank you for the opportunity today to be able to flag a few of the issues, who we are as an institution, our neutral, impartial humanitarian action, the need for the interface between the development world and the humanitarian world to be stronger, more robust, and more reflected. Thank you. And it's my great delight to actually introduce the next guest, a colleague and friend of mine, Volker from UNHCR. Volker, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm also very happy to be here and to have a chance to engage with all of you about the topic of displacement and refugee movements. And I think Helen has done an incredibly good job in bringing the law to life by making sure that some of the examples that you have mentioned are also informing our discussions today. I would like to focus more on the displacement issues. As you know, displacement has really become a defining feature of modern times. And if you just have to look at the numbers, 68.5 million people displaced as a result of conflict, of human rights abuses, as a result of persecution, out of whom 40 million displaced internally. About 28 million people who have crossed an international border as refugees or as asylum seekers who need international protection. So the numbers are staggering. And it is absolutely clear that with these numbers, the international community has to come together to find solutions to this particular issue. And I think it's also important to understand that 85% of those who manage to cross an international border, refugees, actually stay close to the areas of conflict. They do not move on, despite the fact that sometimes in the media we hear other things, and even among populist politicians. It is not correct. 85% stay closest. They stay sometimes in the poorest countries, in the poorest parts of countries, but also in middle-income countries. So they are unfortunately in parts of the world that suffer and are challenged through development themselves. I mean, just think of Uganda. I'm amazed by how much Uganda, within a couple of months, was able to receive 1 million refugees from South Sudan. And they received them in a part of their country that is very challenged from a development perspective, where there is no infrastructure available and so forth. So I think it's important to bear this in mind. But since this is very much a legal audience, I would like to focus a bit on the rule of law and how the rule of law interacts with displacement issues. And there are actually 3 dimensions. The first dimension is one, rule of law is crucial to understanding the reasons behind refugee movements. If you listen to the stories of refugees every day, you will quickly realize that it has a lot to do with weak, sometimes dysfunctioning rule of law structures. If minority protection doesn't work anymore, for example, if the judiciary is so politicized that it does not protect the minorities against the majority, you can imagine what this means for the individual. The same, for example, when it comes to nationality, deprivation of nationality, as we have seen in the context of Myanmar, for example. At the end of the day, people do not belong to that state, and they are subjected to human rights abuses, which triggers movement. We also know in the context of journalists, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of association, the various freedoms that the rule of law guarantees, and including the judiciary in particular and the legal profession. If that doesn't work, you will eventually see people move on because of what they have experienced. And that's, if you like, very much and very closely interlinked. The second dimension, rule of law, is crucial to ensuring that lives are saved when people become refugees. It is crucial to ensuring that international protection is granted to them. And what does international protection mean? I'm going again into the legal sphere. As a citizen, you can rely on the consular and diplomatic protection of your country of origin. That's what normally happens. That's not what refugees can do. They cannot rely on their country of origin because they are actually, in a way, there is a rupture between them and the country of origin, and as a result, they need international protection. And that international protection was defined in the wake of the Second World War through the establishment. We are not as old as the International Committee of the Red Cross with its solid legal regime, but with a legal regime that was established in 1951 with the Geneva Convention and subsequent instruments, the 1967 protocol. And they, first of all, define who a refugee is, but they also provide for a very specific standard of treatment that is due to refugees. And that's, again, very important. It also gave birth to an institution, the institution that I represent, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is not just obligated, but which is expected to intercede on behalf of individuals with governments, with everyone else, so that people who flee conflict, who flee violence, who flee human rights violations are actually protected, that they are given the safety that they require. And I think that's quite remarkable as an institution, which was, I think, very much built on the example that the International Committee of the Red Cross had when in relation to international humanitarian law. When it comes to international refugee law, we have this institution, the custodian, the guardian of the international legal regime that deals specifically with refugees, and that gave birth to that. The third dimension when it comes to rule of law is related to solutions. When you want to find solutions in today's world, and quite frankly it has become very difficult because a lot of conflicts continue. As a result, many refugee situations are protracted. They last for a very long time, so often more than 10, 20 years. I mean, just look at Afghanistan, look at the Syria conflict at the moment, but look at Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic. Unfortunately, we are faced with long-standing, protracted conflict situations. So it is very difficult to find solutions, but when solutions are found and when return becomes possible, it is essentially about the restoration of national protection. And that directly speaks to rule of law issues. It's about housing, land and property rights. It's about civil documentation. It's about restoring the social contract that the individual once had with the country of origin through nationality, for example, or through civil documentation. So all of this brings the rule of law dimensions together in the displacement context. And let me finish by mentioning an incredible process that we have been engaged in over the last 18 months. And I can commend to you the reading of the Global Compact on Refugees. In fact, you may have heard about the Global Compact on Migration, but there is actually another compact. There are two. One is on migration and the other one is on refugees that have been developed over the last 18 months with very strong World Bank engagement. The World Bank was represented throughout this process with all member states of the United Nations to address one issue that has been a missing link. And that missing link is how to define international cooperation predictably and equitably to share responsibilities for those countries that are particularly affected. Just think of Lebanon, 1 million people, refugees with a population of 4.5. What does this mean for a country? Or think of Ethiopia, or think of Uganda, with the enormity that they face with the magnitude, or Pakistan, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, that have been hosting millions of refugees for a very long time. It's absolutely clear that these countries need concrete, tangible support from the international community because, of course, 1 million people very quickly affects health, infrastructure, education systems. And I know you say divide here. What the Global Compact on Refugees actually does, it defines the nexus between humanitarian action, between what development means, and it ties it together, quite frankly. And the glue in between is the protection dimension, is the rule of law dimension, because of course, in order for it to work, both worlds, you need a rights-based approach. You need to be oriented towards the people, towards the individuals, and particularly also making sure that there is a gender equality dimension that is attached to it. What the Global Compact has also done, and we hope for its adoption at the end of this year by the General Assembly, what the Global Compact has also done is that it has managed to put into words a much stronger development agenda, especially when it comes to inclusivity, and analyzing the socio-economic impact that countries face, and making sure that it's not just about programming for refugees, but also for host communities. So that at the end of the day, a text that is negotiated laboriously over many months brings to life what it means and actually directly affects and touches the lives of people. And that's what we hope to achieve in our cooperation with all of you, and in particular with the institutions, including the international financial institutions. So thank you very much. It's a great pleasure now for me to introduce Frank, who is going to be our next speaker.
Thank you, Volker. All right, good evening, everybody. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer. So I will try to adapt to the audience, so I apologize in advance. Now, I'm very happy to be here. Many thanks for Sandy, actually, for organizing this event, for your leadership, but also for being part of this session on the nexus, not the division, but actually the nexus between humanitarian and development actors. And if I'm very pleased to be here, as you know, I'm in charge of what we call the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. It's precisely because the bank is really committed to make a difference in this type of settings. We know that business as usual would mean that by 2030, not far from today, about 50% of the extreme poor will be in countries impacted by fragility, conflict and violence, fragile states. And therefore for us, we really over the past few years, we have really changed the way of doing business. Not only we are scaling up in terms of financing, but more importantly, we are really realizing that we need to shifting towards more prevention, trying to anticipate crisis, shifting also in the way that we work with other actors. Because when you work in fragile settings, in insecure area, you need, meaning you as a development partner, to really engage with other partners, not the one that look alike you, but the one that brings this complementarity. And that's why in fragility, conflict and violence, it's extremely important to partner with organizations such as ICRC, and such as UNHCR. So I'm just going to give today 3 examples of situations where you could see the bank partnering with humanitarian actors. There are many others, as I mentioned. For us, the rule of the game is actually to partner with humanitarian, but also peace-building, security actors. I could talk about it. I'm just going to focus on those partners today. The first situation is actually working with, in the case of active conflicts. More and more, as you may know, since 2010, the number of violent conflicts worldwide tripled. So the bank, the World Bank, is actually engaged more and more in conflicts. It's the case in Iraq, it's the case in Yemen. In Yemen, as you know, it's one of the worst humanitarian catastrophe of those days. We have 14 million people that are in risk of starvation. 75% of Yemenis are actually in need of humanitarian assistance. But it's not only an issue of humanitarian agenda. It's also an issue for development actors, such as the World Bank. We don't have any staff in Yemen for security conditions, but we realize that there is a need to provide additional support to what is being currently provided by UN partners. And that's why we are actually having a program of more than $1 billion of IDA funding in Yemen, when we don't have actually staff on the ground, supporting social safety net, really focusing on medium to long-term solutions in complementarity to humanitarian assistance, looking at issues such as cholera, looking at food insecurity, and we are partnering with organizations such as UNICEF, WHO, who, by the way, have still feet on the ground, and we are leveraging their capacity to implement projects when we don't have this capacity during active conflicts. So it's one good example where you're going to see more and more often, unfortunately, the World Bank being present during active conflict, or in very insecure situations where we need absolutely, if we want to remain relevant and not lose this development dividend to be present and partnering with other organizations. Another situation that I would like to mention is the whole, building on what Volker mentioned, the whole forced displacement agenda. Very important. Now, a few years ago, we used to say, you know, dealing with refugees, it's really about humanitarian. It's not about development. Unfortunately, 90% of refugees live in developing countries. And in fact, on average, in protracted situations, about refugees would stay, what, about 21, I mean, statistics can change, but about 21 years in the exile. It's the case of Afghanistan, it's the case of Ethiopia. So what does it mean? It means that the whole refugee agenda, and as you know, we have about 28 million refugees worldwide that are living in those developing countries. The whole refugee agenda is not only humanitarian, but it's actually also a development issue. When you have children that are, and Volker was mentioning the whole Syria crisis, that are living in Jordan and Lebanon. Let's not forget that, by the way, Jordan and Lebanon receive the highest number of refugees per capita. Is it just an issue of providing water, blanket, and humanitarian support? When you are going to have children that are going to stay 5, 10 years or more in those countries? No, it's actually the whole point of not losing a generation. So it's the whole point of development support. And that's why the World Bank is actually scaling up in this issue of refugee that used to be seen more for humanitarian actors. And we are providing not only financing, but we are partnering with UNHCR in a way that we have never partnered. And when I say that, it's not on paper. It's partnering, doing joint missions. Why? Because UNHCR has actually some skills assessing the refugee policy framework that we don't have. But also because it's very important to see about how we can incentivize, through our financing, that UNHCR may not have, policies of government hosting refugees, which, by the way, are providing a global public good. One of the examples is Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, as you may know, World Bank is actually scaling up its financing, supporting the government, and we provided last June $200 million IDA program, which aims to provide support to hosting communities, but also to refugees, providing 100,000 jobs to refugees and hosting communities. We have about 900,000 refugees, by the way, in Ethiopia. So you can really see the leadership of the government in terms of having pro-refugee policy and using this financing as an incentive and moving towards the issue about providing jobs, making sure that those refugees are more and more integrated to the population, but also looking at the legal documentation. All those sensitive topics worldwide that are being tackled and on which we are partnering with UNHCR supporting Ethiopia. It's not only Ethiopia. We could look at middle-income countries. We could look at low-income countries, because once again, 90% of refugees are in developing countries. And it's our role to deal with this issue, which is not only humanitarian, it's also medium and long-term. So, second topic, the first one we looked at working in active conflict situation where we need to partner with organizations that have a comparative advantage to us, but also looking at the forced displacement agenda where it's a must to deal with it, not only from a humanitarian perspective, but because of the notion of protracted crisis to deal with a development approach. The third example I will also mention in terms of partnership between humanitarian and development actors is actually the whole prevention agenda. The bank, as I was mentioning before, is really pivoting to prevention. What does that mean? It means that instead of just providing support during crisis, as I mentioned, or post-crisis, as part of the reconstruction agenda, we're trying to see how can we help government dealing with some of the grievances so that situations of violence do not escalate to become a conflict. So it's really a big shift, not only of the bank, but also of the international community to see how can we be more anticipated in crisis situation instead of dealing with deep state of fragility. One case, for example, is the whole point of food insecurity and famine. As you may know, we have 124 million people that are actually facing crisis level of food insecurity worldwide. Again, like for the forced displacement issue, you remember, is it just a humanitarian agenda? Or is it actually both humanitarian and development? It's a good example about the bank joining force, recognizing that, yes, we can deal with famine and dealing with response of famine when you start to see children, unfortunately, dying on the screen. But it's also maybe better to try to see how can we anticipate, focusing on prevention, trying to act on some early warning system and starting to finance, from a development perspective, some programs that will help to mitigate the risk of famine. So recently, there's been launch of a major program the famine action mechanism between UNSG, Mr. Guterres, and the President of the World Bank, but in full partnership with WFP, FAO, ICRC, and other actors, because we recognize this is actually a very important agenda that requires not only humanitarian support, but also development support. So I would just finish here. I would just to mention again that the bank is scaling up significantly in terms of providing support in countries that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. In fact, over the next 3 years, we are scaling up our financing from $7 to $14 billion, but the financing is probably not the most important at all. The way that we are changing, the way with all humility we recognize that we need to partner with organizations from security, peace building, and humanitarian actors is probably the most important. Why? Because otherwise we will be more confined in area of the capital city where in fact we realize that the most difficult and the most challenging situations are in area where we don't have necessarily the feet on the ground and where we need to deal with some of those challenges such as refugee challenge, forced displacement, food insecurities, where there is really a need to bridge the humanitarian development nexus. So I will stop here, and many thanks again for being part of it. As you can see, it's really the new norm, working with humanitarian actors and with other institutions. I think it's the only way that we can hope, not getting into the statistics of 50% of extreme poor in countries that are being impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. Thank you.
So much, Frank. I'd now like to invite our panelists to join me on stage, please. Thank you once again to our excellent presenters for their eye-opening, exciting, and very diverse talks. We will have a good time to discuss and unpack some of the issues that you have raised. Good afternoon once more to everyone here in the Preston Auditorium and to all of you who are joining us online. We are live streaming this event on World Bank Live and Facebook Live. My name is Sheila Redzepi. I'm the Vice President for External and Corporate Relations here at the World Bank, and I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Now, lots to ask, much to reflect on. Sandy, I want to turn to you first. What stood out for you in terms of the issues that our presenters raised? What caught your eye? What would you like to share with us?
Thank you, Sheila. Where do I start? In such a short space of time, so much. The first one that really, wow, was that bankers started the International Committee of the Red Cross. I mean, this brings us almost full circle to where we are today. And this nexus point, which is very important. I think that was a key theme from Helen, Volker, and Frank, that there is a nexus between the humanitarian world and the development world that cannot be ignored. And when I go around on my travels and I visit different countries and particularly speak to attorney generals and ministers of justice about what we do, I think there's sometimes a surprise that it's not all about infrastructure. And that we have moved on as a bank. And I think this is really interesting, listening to all those three speakers, that you cannot separate out those worlds if we want the development outcomes that we want. And I was particularly interested in what Helen said, that where there are inequalities that exist before conflict, they will be worse after conflict. And there's statements like these that are really important for us in the development world to mean that whatever we have achieved from a development perspective will be undone from a conflict perspective. So we need to work together to make sure that doesn't happen. And the complementarity, I think, is something that is really, really important, Sheila, which is we all have very distinct things that we do, but we certainly complement each other and we need to work on that. And the idea, I think it was you, Frank, that said, you know, we were all in different places and never the twain shall meet, has disappeared. And I think it's disappeared for a while now. And with Volker, the rule of law point, oh, you were talking to me as a lawyer there, Volker, talking to me as a lawyer. It is crucial. And there was something that you said I'm going to take away with me because I'd never thought about it in that way, is that when you are a refugee, you cannot rely on your consulate or your home country for those protections we take for granted when we travel. It's so obvious, yet so important, and that's why the international rule of law, the development of refugee law is crucial, because we're talking about something very different here and very important. And I have to say, I'm glad that you mentioned the gender dimension as well, because we all know that from a refugee and displaced persons perspective, women are particularly vulnerable. So I think that, you know, the cost of conflict, that I think there was a figure that 90% of refugees live in developing countries. That's a cost to development, a cost to conflict, a cost to those countries, and a cost to all of us in this room as well. So I think those themes really, really stood out for me. But we are in that situation now where it's all about nexus, it's all about complementarity, and what we all bring to the table so that we can make sure that the development outcomes we all want and the peace outcomes occur.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sandy. I want to pick up on that point about complementarity, which sits at the heart of the humanitarian development nexus. Now, it's in many ways perhaps not new. We've been talking about the divide, the continuum, the very distinct but complementary roles that humanitarian and development organizations play. And there's certainly big enough of a challenge out there for all of us to address. So the point I'd like to have you all reflect on a little bit is what progress have we seen over time in recent years, and what are still some of the barriers that we need to overcome? And Volker, I wanted to start with you, and it's a question that I'm going to ask all of you, one that with that unique perspective of custodians of the rule of law, which resonated with me as well, Sandy. What's the entry point into this conversation? What are some of the ways that we could learn from past successes, and what are the barriers that we need to still remove?
No, I think we hear today there's a lot of discussion about a rule-based order, a rule-based governance, both obviously at the domestic, local level, and also at the multilateral level. And it all has its sense, let's not forget that. So we have a system in place when it comes to refugees in particular that was established in the wake of the Second World War. It came out of a particular historical context. Let's not forget we had 60 million people displaced at the time in Europe. People forget this when they talk about 1 million now. 60 million were on the move then. And I think that particular legal framework was there because it responded to needs that were identified then. That legal framework has proven its value. The legal regime for refugees is a living instrument, or it's a living organism, if you like, that responds and adapts over time to evolving facets of people who are in need of international protection. So we did a lot of work on gender-related persecution, for example. We did a lot of work on those fleeing violence and conflicts, but within the rules that were agreed upon at the end of the Second World War. And we sometimes hear that, oh, this was all Cold War type thinking. No, it wasn't. What we experience today and what we learned over the last 70 years or so was as relevant as it was then. And it is as relevant as it is now. So there is a very strong connection with today's problems, with today's challenges. So they are not outdated. Law proves itself adaptable to evolving circumstances and facets of life. And I think that's important to bring into the debate, because sometimes we think, oh, well, these are dusted conventions. No, they're not. They deal about social phenomena. They deal about life as we see it. It's not that different whether it was then or now, when you're forced to flee. And we just have to deal with the consequences. And I mentioned the Global Compact in particular because it deals with the gap that we have faced for much too long.
Thank you. And we are obviously, given the nature of our work, focused on addressing barriers. We must do that. There are always lessons to be learned. Helen, I want to turn to you right now, an organization that's benefited from 150 plus years of experience. You have seen things that have worked. What are some of the success stories also, before you reflect a little bit on some of the issues and barriers that we still ought to be focusing on?
Well, I think it's very important that you've asked me that question about success, because I do feel today, if I may put success in a paradigm of challenge for a moment, is that we have had huge advances. If you look at the statistics of those who are killed during times of armed conflict compared to post-World War II, where I think the statistics were out of 300,000 people, the numbers were extraordinary. Today we see unacceptable suffering during times of armed conflict, but there are particular weapons, whether it be anti-personnel landmines, whether it be cluster munitions, whether it be biological weapons, that you do not see in use as much as you did previously. I mean, I am a deep believer in the law. I love being an international lawyer, and you two spoke to my heart when you spoke about the rule of law. But we all know that the law is a clumsy tool to try and quickly change behaviour. It's a powerful tool, but it takes time. And I think often today we only hear about the law, particularly the area I work in, international humanitarian law, we only hear about it when it's failed. You don't hear, today prisoners of war were treated with integrity, or today there was no executions, or today there was not sexual violence perpetrated upon young girls in a village. So I think the general public, whilst we have more law, more capacity to prosecute, more capacity to train, and we are seeing globally a reduction in suffering, still suffering, unacceptable but reduction, I think we often fall into what I would call the discourse of despair, which allows us to just stay in the problem analysis and doesn't look at the tools, the way that communities can be trained to explain that the laws of war are relevant, the way that the militaries often know now that if they might win the battle but they lose the war because it's known that they haven't got the right way of treating civilians. So I think this idea about making sure that we as international lawyers also talk about the positive experiences. And in fact, we have a website called Change the Narrative on IHL, where we've taken examples where a change in a regulation has saved lives. So I think there's something about not eroding ourselves by only pointing out the failures, but just briefly on the challenges. Today we see that conflict is more protracted, it's more urbanised, and it has a fluidity of the partners. There's more non-state armed groups in the last 7 years than the last 7 decades. And so some of these challenges is how we not only enforce, but how we engage and connect, and how we make sure that, as I said before, that the work that you all do in trying to have development, rule of law, isn't washed away in an armed conflict that ignores the rule of law.
Thank you for raising some of the unique features of what we're seeing right now, and that I think is a brilliant opportunity, Frank, for you to reflect a little bit on what are some of the lessons we're learning on the ground. What's the perspective that that has informed your current thinking about how we work together in this very unique space where humanitarian development players reinforce one another? What are those issues? What have you observed?
So thank you. No, I mean, just building on Helen's point, I think changing the narrative is quite important. Realizing that it's not only a question of financing, but it's more a question of breaking silo and making sure that at the end of the day, you don't just partner for the pleasure of partnering, but just to solve issues. And yes, those issues, when you talk about forced displacement, they are requiring not only short-term assistance, as I mentioned, but also long-term approach. And therefore, when I see, for instance, over the past 2 years, the way that we have been partnering, I was mentioning, in middle-income countries, Jordan, Lebanon, hosting refugees at a level which is, just amazing. The way that we have put together this global concessional financing facility, leveraging $2.5 billion in 2 years of projects in Lebanon and Jordan with UNHCR, with other multilateral development banks, by the way, and with many bilaterals, recognizing that countries like Jordan, Lebanon are providing a global public good, opening their borders, and therefore we are supporting them to ensure they continue to move towards pro-refugee policy, but also providing support, jobs, providing services to both hosting communities and refugees, ensuring that there is some social integration. So we've been moving quite well, because it's not only a low-income country issue, it's also a middle-income country issue. We're also moving with under ADA 18 by supporting 9 countries that have been eligible. Again, are we doing by ourselves? Absolutely not. We're doing that first under the leadership of the countries, let's not forget. They are the one who are hosting refugees. They are the one providing a global public good. 90% of refugees, they are not in Europe, they are not anywhere else, they are in developing countries. And we are just partnering with UNHCR at a level that we could not imagine it 2-3 years ago. So what does it mean, Sheila? That progress is on the ground. It's not about talking, it's not about financing, but it's about actually leveraging other institutions to make a difference in an issue that requires both short-term and medium to long-term approach. I was talking just before about the way also we deal with food insecurity and famine. That's not just about books or paper. Anyway, the way that we last year providing support in 4 countries affected by famine, the way we work together with ICRC in Somalia, because there was a really comparative advantage that ICRC had versus the World Bank, or the way we are thinking about working together, it could be in South Sudan, in health sectors. Why? Because again, it's not about partnering and being here in a nice event. It's about making a difference on the ground with actors that provide complementarity to what we are doing. So we are clearly moving forward significantly. I have to say that in less than 2 years, we have partnered at the country level in more than 23 crisis-affected situations. That's significant. It's with Humanitarian, but it's also with peacekeepers, with all the peace-building actors, looking at DRC, looking at CAR, where we partner with MONUSCA, with MONUSCO, to try to see where there is some space for development and how we can make sure that we provide services not only in Bangui, but also in Bambari. And I was actually with Peter Moya in this part of the world. So I think we're really moving well together. So I have to say that the whole point for us is to recognize that we are breaking silos, just because we need to have more impact in those most insecure areas where we don't have also staff on the ground necessarily, and we don't have the intelligence. So in addition of providing complementarity to what humanitarian actors do, it's also recognizing that in many cases they bring added value by being present in areas where we cannot be. So it's a question of humility, I think, and recognizing that no development actors can do it alone, especially in areas that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. I mean, partnership is key everywhere, but I think in area impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence, this is simply a must. You are not efficient if you are not humble enough to realize that development support is good, focusing on poverty and growth is great, but if you don't have stability, if you don't understand the dynamics that other actors are bringing on board, you are not going to be as efficient.
Thank you. Very quickly, Volker, I cannot help but ask you to reflect a little bit on that. Partnership is key. How key is it to effective delivery? How do you look at that?
So in the refugee world, for many, many years, you had essentially 2 parallel systems. You had a system for refugees, so you had parallel schooling, you had parallel almost health facilities, you had all kinds of parallelism, and you had very often in many countries around the world also an encampment policy. So we're basically warehousing refugees, as if their life was put on hold, they can't get on with their lives, they are not, they can't produce and engage meaningfully because they are sort of, well, these are refugees, they, especially in the global south, I have to say, and there's no interaction then with the host community, and that's really wrong. I think we have realized over the years that indeed you cannot just reduce it to the humanitarian space. The humanitarian space is absolutely crucial in the emergency phase for quite some time to come, but we do need the right policies to come in, as Ethiopia has done, as Uganda has done, as Djibouti and many other countries have realized also in those countries that are particularly affected by refugee movements, and talk about inclusivity. Uganda has a progressive policy. They have essentially integrated refugees in their national development program. That's remarkable, because very often in many countries around the world, they are foreigners, they are non-nationals. There's no constituency for them. There's no political capital to be gained. But if you address the right approach, you can actually get the political capital, because you can develop the host community, the host country, and the refugee community, so it becomes a win-win.
Thank you. And Helen, you made that point in your talk, so please do weigh in.
I just wanted to add into that, because I think partnership is a really critical thing, but behind partnership, I think, is also about being honest about where we do differ, I mean, the International Committee of Red Cross, in the way we go, we work on trusted, confidential dialogue to allow us to actually, both the security to get into places that no other people or organisations go. So there are a good partnership, as we all hope we have in our lives with families and friends and partners, also knows about being, when we have to be distinct and being intelligent about when we say, well, we can't do that, and when we can say, actually, we can do that. So to me, the whole interface between the Nexus humanitarian development divide, which is required, it's not a divide, I think I like the word, the complementarity is required, particularly as I expressed, when conflict today is so protracted. I mean, we're a deeply humanitarian emergency organisation. We've been organising ourselves every year. We do a planning. We've been doing that once a year for 30 years for Afghanistan. Do we need to start thinking a little differently about the way we engage and what we do? But I think critical, I just wanted to flag that partnership and complementarity means we find the places we can work and we have a sense of ease in the areas where we differ, and that's the real strength. We work under the laws of war, others work under refugee law, others work under human rights law, and they're all interconnected. But if we actually lose the distinction, I think we lose something very important in the normative framework.
And I think that space is becoming clearer and clearer based on the many conversations we, of course, have this in this constituency. So the thing we're all talking about and thinking about is that over the past few years, we have faced a number of pretty significant challenges. We're looking at, of course, the refugee crisis, the pandemics, natural disasters compounded by, of course, climate change. If we're to look at history as any indicator of how we ought to be looking ahead, that's kind of telling me that perhaps we should be reading the signs better. Or should we be moving from reaction to preparation more swiftly? What is it that you're seeing on the horizon, the things that worry you, and what should we be preparing for? And I'm going to start with Frank this time round, and then I will turn to Volker and to Helen after you.
Thank you. No, I think that the big shift, as I was mentioning before, I think is a shift towards prevention. We just actually released talking about partnership with the UN. It was actually the first joint UN World Bank report called Pathway for Peace that was precisely having two conclusions. The first one, $1 invested in prevention allows to save $16 down the road. But also it was to recognize the importance of partnering even from development actors, not only at the time of reconstruction, but actually on prevention side. And it's true when you're looking at natural disaster, when you're looking at pandemics, when you're looking at so many other risks, looking at El Nino, looking at the armyworm, looking about Ebola. They are really, the point is about how can we strengthen the capacity of government to be more resilient, and how we can partner with organizations on the ground and humanitarian actors so that we can be more effective on the prevention side rather than always responding. Good example was again the famine. If you look at the famine, first 90% of the famine happens in countries impacted by fragility, conflict and violence. So there's a whole agenda about what can we do to some extent, in some case, to prevent this risk of fragility and violence. The second point is also to recognize that in many cases, unfortunately, we have been quite efficient, but in the response. Have we been able to detect the risk of food insecurity early in advance? Have we been able to do what we do in some cases on natural disasters, but being able to strengthen the resilience of those governments to deal with food insecurity? Maybe not. And I think right now there is a major shift towards realizing that we need to be much more agile in the prevention space by looking at the complementarity, if we take the example of the famine, about humanitarian response, but also development agenda. What can we do on social safety net? What can we do in terms of the ag sectors, so that we can not always be on the response side? I mean, 2 years ago, we provided significant, last year actually, providing more than $1.5 billion IDA response to the famine in 4 countries. That was excellent, and that's why I mentioned the partnership with all the UN agencies and with ICRC. But the point is that, can we move by working with other actors towards the detection of the risk of famine so that we can better anticipate, and can we be able to trigger some financing based on those signals, as we have been doing in other sectors. So clearly, down the road, if you are looking at the terms of agenda, I think the prevention is extremely important, but again, that requires different ways of providing financing, different ways of capturing signal of a risk, and also different ways of associating ourselves with other actors that have better knowledge, including local NGO, by the way, not only international NGO, of the situation on the ground.
Thank you. Reaction, preparation, prevention, dare I say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you mentioned a couple of these mega topics and trends that we all, and actually in the displacement context, they play out in different ways and they show the interconnection. For instance, environmental degradation is often experienced as a precursor to conflict, because then it becomes a competition over resources. And we see this, just Lake Chad region, for example, to give you to mention this, because we saw the environmental degradation. If then the state is not there or is weak and is not interacting with the population, it can lead to radicalization, for example. So we see this interconnectivity between these different reasons. And again, rule of law comes in, because the rule of law is fundamentally about the functions of a state, the delivery of the fundamental functions of a state in terms of providing a safe and secure environment, making sure that people have access to services, ensuring that there is this sense of belonging between the individual and the conglomerate of what constitutes the state. And that is often missing. We see it, another example, Myanmar. When 82, the citizenship law was changed, it meant the essential deprivation of nationality of a significant part of the population. That was a long time ago. But you then see the erosion of more and more aspects of treatment of this population, and at some stage it explodes. And we have seen this. We saw this last year and actually in previous years as well. So we see this, we need to work some of these early indicators when the judiciary is getting less and less independent, because then the judiciary can't protect the minorities, for example. And that's part of a constitutional setup very often in many countries around the world. If impunity reigns, and I saw that in the Central African Republic. I mean, you know, at some stage during the crisis, there were no lawyers available anymore, because either they were led or they fled or they were killed. And that really creates a huge situation where, of course, you have anarchy and chaos reigning or coming in. And I think it's very important to see this connection with rule of law and the early warning indicators that need to trigger very quickly a response to that.
Thank you. Reading those early warning signs is difficult. It's tricky, Helen. What do we have to do?
Yeah, look, I think there's many things we have to do. I think the first thing we have to do is look at the temporal pace where people expect solutions. We live in a very complicated, interlayered world, and complicated problems required complicated solutions. And I think today we're in this strange time zone where people expect a soundbite solution to a problem that might be multi-layered. And I think this whole fact that ICRC is sitting up here talking to the World Bank and UNHCR on these issues is symbolic of the need that we do not have the luxury of not working together better. I mean, we have one world as far as we know. There's no spaceship out of here if we can't get it right. So we need to be able to come up with these layered solutions, which means, as I said before, we need to understand who we are. But I think the issue of prevention is critical, and we've just done a very large study. I think it's the largest in the world. Thousands of both military officers and non-state armed groups interviewed, and it's been able to demonstrate that pre-deployment training about the laws of war does have an impact. We knew it did. I held my breath as Director of Law and Policy with hundreds of lawyers and military officers training, but you have to ask these bold questions and then test ourselves. But I think this idea of we can change people's behaviour, we can influence them. History has shown that, and where we need to lean into this prevention discourse. The prevention for ICRC is about the prevention of the commission of atrocities. In others, it might be, as you said, Volker, so beautifully, the prevention of the degradation of the rule of law that we know leads to these issues. We've also undertaken research to show that compliance following international humanitarian law does have an impact upon displacement. It makes sense. If you don't destroy the hospital system, the schools, the sewage, people are less likely to flee. We sort of intuitively knew that, but we've looked into that issue a little more. So I think there's something about people being braver and bolder about prevention. It sometimes doesn't capture the media attention, because the problem with prevention is you're trying to prove the counterfactual. So I often look to my colleague who's the director of operations, and he can show very easily, we've set up this hospital, we've done this. And I have to say, my work means something didn't happen. If we do training of the military, we hope this didn't happen. And somehow I think we need to be braver about talking about that. So there's something in that area for both the short term, but as we're talking today about the long term.
And Sandy, I thoughts on prevention as well. And the reason I ask is there are enough challenges, and the scale of them is quite different than anything we've ever seen before. So we are quite busy in that space as well. So dealing with prevention, and of course dealing with responding to, reacting and preparing to some of the immediate issues that we're looking to address from your perspective, again, as a custodian of rule of law, what do you think are some of the things that we should be watching for, building for, so that we minimize the scale of future challenges to come?
Wow, what a question.
For you.
For me. The working together cannot be underestimated, because I'm looking at the screen there and it says different approaches. It's also distinct, which is a word that Helen used, and that's an important thing. We do different things. The idea that you go into places where no other organisation can possibly go, and I do know that from some of the work we've been doing together, is really important. And the information we can get from that, because no one else can get that information, that downstream to where we are in terms of economic development, is so crucial. And we need to make sure that that information, that knowledge, that outlook is tied together. Otherwise, we're all going off doing different things, wanting different outcomes, and not really thinking about the impact and the actual harm we might be inadvertently causing, which I think is very important. So that linking things together so that the approach makes sense is, I think, what we can do. And you know, as you said, and I think that Volko and Frank have said, the mere fact we're all here together, we're already working closely together, is really important. And I'm new to development. I only started in this area in February 2017. And one thing I'm absolutely certain about, and I know there are lots of challenges with multilateralism and globalism, etc., is if organizations like UNHCR, the bank, and the International Committee of the Red Cross did not exist, you would have to invent them. Mm-hmm. But they'd be virtually impossible to invent now, I think, because first of all, the lawyers would get in the way and go, impossible, impossible, because of this, that, and the other. And we would, come on, you know, because it would be very difficult to do now. You'd need a huge amount of vision and a huge amount of letting go. But we have them now, and we should use them. And we should use them because the collective knowledge that we all have in different areas, and we have different knowledge, is key to what we want from development outcomes and from what you want as well. And we've learnt so much from UNHCR and from the International Committee of the Red Cross, just from working closely together, that have, as we know, impacted our development outlooks. And I just want to say a little bit, going back to gender and sexual violence and gender-based violence from women in conflict. A lot of that information will come from organizations like UNHCR and the International Committee of the Red Cross, who can give us information in that, and we can understand that. So I think that new way of looking at things in this 21st century, that yes, we are different and we are distinct, but we also can add the word complement to that, I think is key.
Thank you. And Frank, I'll get to you right away, and I think you might want to weigh in on this one. And then a couple of questions from folks online, very relevant and particularly to this question on what then should we not be tapping into technology, technological disruption, data, different ways of sharing, using information? How important is that from your perspective? What could we be doing? Sandy, you prompted me, so I will turn to Frank, who raised his hand, rather than you, and then go around and get some perspectives around on the panel here, because I do think there's an opportunity for us to think differently. And what role for innovation in that space? Given the scale of the challenge, the need to change the narrative, what role for innovation for technology?
Thank you. Now I will come back to technology, but I really wanted to rebound on the point of Hélène and actually Sandy about what is sometimes is confusing is that depending on the situation, the partnership will not be the same. So it means it can be actually by getting information, we need to partner with ICRC because you are talking with some organization that we don't talk to. You are talking with armed groups. You have a better understanding about what is the situation in Central African Republic. And for us, as the World Bank, when we are moving towards addressing the root cause of fragility and not being business as usual, this partnership is super important. Otherwise, we're going to finance bridges or roads that honestly will not have any impact on the ground and making a difference. So I think sometimes it's a question of information. You were mentioning, Sandy, the whole gender-based violence, where I do believe that organizations on the ground, local NGO, ICRC also, can really be super impactful so that we don't come with our major program that don't necessarily have the impact that we'll be looking for. Sometimes it's because we are not present on the ground. You remember the Yemen example? Well, for security reasons, our staff are not present in Yemen. But guess what? UNDP, UNOPS, or actually WHO, ICRC, WFP are present. Does it make sense to partner with them? Yes, unless you want to be absent during this period where it's so important to provide everyone support. And then other cases where it's actually the whole point about we need humanitarian support, the whole refugee agenda, but guess what? Protracted crises are such that those kids are going to stay 10, 15 years. So if you are not looking at education, if you are not looking at the health services for 5, 10, 15 years, which humanitarian agencies are not doing, you are missing the boat. So I think, no, depending on the situation, this whole point about working together is actually quite different. And sometimes we all put together, we all say, oh yeah, we need to work together. No, not necessarily. You work together when it makes a difference. And our partnership in Yemen, it will be different than in Ethiopia and will be completely different in CR. And that's why sometimes we get confused. No, technology, super important technology, of course. I think the whole point, you mentioned, I think, Sandy, you mentioned the partnership that we have established again with UNHCR on a joint data center, because we need to ensure that we are going to have policies that are evidence-based. And again, did it make sense for the World Bank to launch a data center on refugees by itself? No, because the expertise is actually here on my left. The same, we're looking at the famine. We're trying to detect the risk of famine. And here we're trying to partner with organizations, AI firms such as Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, because they have the capacity about improving the predictability so that we can enter in partnership with organizations that are really doing a great business in terms of addressing famine, which is FAO, WFP, but trying to see about how we can strengthen the system by focusing more about the risk of famine, and that's that. So clearly the partnership with technology is extremely important. The whole remote satellite information, when we are looking at damage in assessment, we could not do it otherwise. When we are supervising our projects, you remember that I mentioned that the bank is moving more and more outside the capital city, actually working in Kivu or working in the Sahel, in area where we cannot have feet on the ground, but we need to have eyes on the ground. How do we do it? Well, we are looking at geo-enabling services. We are looking about a whole technology that allows us to see and monitor the impact of projects. And that's extremely important. We could not do it. I mean, the whole partnership with ICT, with AI, is critical in areas that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. It's not to do better. It's actually to allow us to do third-party monitoring and to supervise so that we can come back to our shareholders and have proof not only that there is an impact, but also that we are following the policies. So it's actually critical. It's like the partnership. It's not good. It's actually a must in those areas.
Great. Thank you. Sandy, you are raising your hand.
Just wanted to say something about data. Before I joined the bank, I was more of a gut instinct kind of girl, and data was good if you needed it. But now I've been here, I've realized the importance of data because it's evidence and it backs what you're saying. But it's also really important when we look at more innovative things, and particularly some financing products that we've done, a pandemic bond that we launched a while back. You can't do that without data, and you can't do that without gathering data, some of which might be difficult to gather. So I think you have to look at it as a whole. Because it's important what we do in relation to our organizations, but also it's important for innovation. And it's important for what is out there in the future, because we don't have a crystal ball, but data can help us understand trajectories and ways that we're going. And lawyers are traditionally not data people. We really don't like numbers. I remember someone saying lawyers are clever people who can't do maths. But we really need to grasp that and understand what it can do for us. Well, I'm certainly one of those lawyers. What it can do for us and what it can show us. So I'm beginning to love data.
Very quickly, if I may, Volker, and then Helen, and I've got a couple of questions that have come in online that I must ask you on another topic, but I want to cover this up.
Just one additional observation, because I'm one of the lawyers who do like data, but the problem is the evidence is fine, and it's important to do it, and the Joint Data Center is fantastic, and the socioeconomic impact analysis that we all have to do, which is not an expertise that UNHCR has, but that the World Bank has, that's a good synergy. But at the end of the day, we also need to make sure that the data and that the results of the analysis actually are matched with political will. And that's not often the case.
Good point.
I think that's still the missing link that needs to be worked on.
And just quickly, data is critical. I'm a lawyer who doesn't like numbers, but I do have a deep appreciation of my colleagues who need to do that. Last year, ICRC visited almost 1 million detainees, and the protection of personal data is critical to us. And I just wanted to flag on the information sharing once we got data. ICRC can be a complex organisation. We work through confidential dialogue with authorities. So our job isn't to engage with our partners and tell them what's going on, because that has an impact on our security and our access. But what are the mega trends we're seeing? When you visit almost 1 million people detained in the most difficult situations, what are we seeing as the big issues, not the individual elements? But I think new technologies, there's a whole lot to discuss, particularly about the militarization of new technologies. We're looking at cyber warfare, drones, human enhancement, artificial intelligence. And I think these can be both used for good in human development, and also we have to be careful how they're used as they relate to the rule of law. But that's another whole topic that maybe we could talk about another day, but very interesting, future-proofing.
Thank you. I'm glad we've established no one likes numbers. So we can move past that very quickly. A very interesting questions come in online. How can social enterprises in general and startups in particular contribute to advancing this agenda? On World Bank Live, I feel like I'm going to go to you, Helen, and then everyone on the panel, if you can reflect on that a little bit.
Certainly, and briefly, because I know we've got all these eminent brains here.
Yes.
Social enterprise and business loans and micro business is essential. I mean, in many places in the world, for example, Afghanistan, ICRC worked with war widows to allow them to reskill and set up bakeries, to be able to find some independence, particularly those who are widowed from armed conflict are often really quite marginalised. I think across the world we can give many examples. There has to be not just a better interface between all of us sitting up here, but the way business and the communities engage before conflict, in prevention. During conflict it's difficult, but post-conflict. So I think absolutely, let's get a better connection. And across the world we see ways that, particularly from a gender point of view, training women, educating young girls is critical, and then giving them self-sustainability.
Thank you. Sandy.
I would agree with that. I was going to say something very similar, which is around what it can do for young girls and women in terms of giving them economic independence, and social enterprises and startups and all of that. They're starting from the beginning. And so it's much easier to build that in from the beginning. And I think that we all know that young women, particularly in more challenging countries, are at the bottom of that pile. And when you are at the bottom of that pile, if you don't have economic independence, you are more likely to face gender-based violence, you're more likely to be cut off from everything. And so I think building that in from the beginning and making that a must would be my answer to that question.
Volker.
I think we have seen a real sea change in the way that the private sector has engaged on refugee issues and areas that host refugees, including with the host community, because I think the private sector was seen more as from the perspective of resource mobilization. But actually there are so many people out there who want to invest, who see the advantages of it. And we can only, through the Global Compact on Refugees, find ways and means to have a strategy with the private sector to actually attract their investments in impacted areas. And I think that's really one of the big future things that we all have to do collectively.
Frank, very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, 90% of jobs in countries that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence are not from the government or state-owned enterprise. They're actually from private sector. And that's why actually we are working with IFC, as you may know, as part of IDA, to have more than $2.5 billion of windows that is precisely looking at de-risking investment for private sectors, because we want to have more job created, and that's actually essential. I mean, the whole point about refugee, we know that jobs is probably the best social integrator, and what you want is actually to ease the tension also between hosting communities and refugees. So you need this holistic approach. That's why we did in Jordan major program supporting the job agenda. We did in Ethiopia, as I just mentioned, supporting the government in this regard. This is essential. It's not only about providing services, it's about creating job opportunities.
Thank you. Were you wanting to weigh in, Sandy? I feel like the hand went up.
Well, it kind of did. I just wanted to sort of feed off what everybody else has said, which is a very practical thing, which is when it comes to refugees, integrating into your local community. And I think, Volker, you mentioned this about, you know, it always seems to be encampments and something very separate. But where you can help with, one of the first things to integrate and get people into communities are jobs. You have to learn the language, you have to you make friends, social customs. That is really important, and it does start with jobs and doing something useful with your time. And that's where, sorry, Volker.
If I could just jump in.
You can, please do.
Because I think it's absolutely crucial, because the connectivity with the host community is in schools, education, in the education area, it's health and livelihoods, employment. The problem is, in many countries, we still have atavistic policies that don't allow employment for refugees, that don't allow wage-gaining type, even self-employment sometimes. And in too many systems, we still have this parallelism, which we need to overcome. So there's still this persuasion work to be done, in particular with governments.
Thank you all for this. I have time for about one question. And one has come in, and very specifically, it's come in for Helen. But I think our panelists may all want to weigh in on this one. It's a difficult one in some ways. How are groups who break the laws of war held accountable for such violations? And views from you, with reference, of course, to the international humanitarian law.
Well, that's a whole seminar, but I see we've got a couple of minutes, so let me do...
Very briefly.
Very briefly, okay. Well, international humanitarian law, the law of war, applies to all parties to a conflict. The Geneva Conventions require states to prosecute anyone, not just the military, but anyone, non-state armed groups or others, who breach fundamental elements, grave breaches and serious violations of IHL. The problem is, as we all know, there's not often a lot of prosecution, so we have now a layer of international prosecution. We know the development of the International Criminal Court, the ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, and many hybrid prosecutions globally where the states are prosecuting their own. So the tool is a stick of prosecution and enforcement, but increasingly what we also need is best practice. We need to find solutions to encourage and explain to these states, because we are not getting where we need to go globally across the world just using the enforcement and prosecution. We also need to have best practices to assist groups. Some groups are more criminal in nature and it's going to be very difficult, but we need to find ways to find solutions, educate and prosecute. We need both ends.
Excellent question for our legal community. Volker, anything from your side to add to that?
Well, I think what we also see, and that's a phenomenon that has arisen over the last couple of years, that sometimes armed groups become then criminal organized groups. And you see sometimes this transformation as well. I mean, some of the violence that we see, for instance, in Latin America, including Central America, is groups, non-state actors, exercising actually almost control over people in certain neighborhoods. And it creates a very difficult issue on its own, including, by the way, on refugee recognition, because there are some governments who say we don't recognize people who flee this type of violence. Well, actually, we would argue the convention was precisely foreseen also to protect people who flee this type of violence, because very often the state is not able or willing to protect them. So that's the core of the refugee definition.
Thank you very much. We've talked about partnerships, including, of course, with social enterprise, complementarity, and what that really means in terms of defining a successful partnership and effective delivery on the ground, not just for the sake of it, but because we bring unique skills and expertise to the table. The opportunity in data and technology to give us some of that insight and ability to innovate and perhaps address some of those long-standing issues in different ways. And we've covered off the area of law, which of course is, it's a tough nut to crack, but certainly one of the more politicized discussions that you would have in this space. Sandy, I want to turn to you now as we're nearing the end of this discussion, and I wish we had more time. We only have a few minutes left. There are lots of big challenges. We've unpacked quite a lot in the excellent presentations that our panelists have shared with us today. What are your closing thoughts on what are some of the aspects of collaboration that you take away from this?
Firstly, I can't believe we've only got 3 minutes left. I think there's something wrong with the clock, because this has gone two now. That's gone so quickly. Told you I wasn't good with numbers. Carrying on the conversation, I think, in one sentence. And this approach that we can do very different things in very different areas, but they complement each other. And, you know, as you were saying, Frank, it's not one size fits all. It's not always going to work in the same way. And I genuinely feel that we are in different times now, and we require different approaches, and we require some vision, and we require some bravery. And as lawyers, we need to be brave in the way we interpret things and the way we see ways forward. There is the black letter law and advising on that, which is what we're paid to do. But there's also the doing the right thing piece. And I think we very much saw that at the beginning of the last century as things were changing then. And I think we're very much in this new place now, whereas particularly as lawyers in the room here, listening online, rule of law, coming back to that point, is really important. But it's evolving, and we need to be part of that evolution and not the stagnation. So that is why we need to look at what we all do, that complementarity in how we work together, and move it forwards, not static, forwards.
Thank you. Sandy, I'm going to have to close this very exciting panel discussion. Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation, and for the entire week that's ahead, where so much of this can be discussed in so many different ways. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined us today for a conversation about one of the more pressing challenges of our time, I would argue, and one that's getting tougher, but so much that we're learning from one another that can help us drive this agenda forward much more effectively. And thank you, of course, to our viewers on World Bank live stream who have joined us today. Now, I do have the pleasure for an announcement to make, which is that, of course, we're all very excited to have you join us for the reception at 6 p.m. At the atrium. Our volunteers will be more than happy to guide you there. But before we do that, may I ask for another round of applause, please, for our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in the MC Atrium.